Okay, now I'm recording. I'm going to repeat everything I just said. The other really exciting announcement is Dr. Agarwal, who spoke at our last meeting. And for those of you who missed it and are interested in potentially tuning in, he is a hospice doctor. Where is he practicing? In Oregon? Where is he actually practicing?
I thought it was Rush. Let's look it up.
Okay, well, but anyway, he's has been using ketamine assisted therapy with his hospice and palliative care patients, and 2 patients requested psilocybin as part of their end of life care, and the DEA denied that access. And so he took them to the 9th District Appeals Court of Appeals down in Arizona, and where is it?
Seattle, Washington.
Seattle, Washington. Okay. And he actually, the Court of Appeals has agreed to take the case and is allowing them to sue the DEA, which is really exciting and could be potentially groundbreaking when they win. And one of the things, if you had asked me even a year ago if I would ever sit down and listen to 3 hours worth of Court of Appeal trials, I would have laughed in your face. But it was so fascinating to hear the judges tearing apart all of these lawyers and how they, had so many different questions. There's a couple of seats here. So many questions for everybody. And then when the lawyer for Dr. Agarwal's team got up there, they sat back and just let him speak the entire time. And then the lawyer for the DEA got up there and they started tearing her apart, and she was eyeing and umming. And then, she was like, well, I just want you to dismiss this case. And then he had a few minutes of rebuttal, and they were like, oh yeah, we're taking the case. So this is potentially groundbreaking. This is really, really exciting news. And the last thing, last announcement, Pammy and Colin are both here. And Aaron, I don't know if you made Synchronicity. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend because we had a lot of things going on that week. But if you guys could talk a little bit about Synchronicity and how that went. Pammy, why don't you?
Sure. Thank you so much, Avery. It was a beautiful event. And honestly, we have Colin here, the executive director, who stressed his team out for the past 10 days, putting it together. But it was incredible. So many people had a great time. We got so much great, positive reviews. But I'll let Colin talk about it. But thank you so much for, asking me to speak to it. But we have, the executive director here who decided to put it together. So we'll take it away, Colin.
Thank you, Pammy. Pammy is correct. We did stretch the team out for 10 days to make it happen. And Pammy completely asked to promote it and made some amazing posters that sold and just got it all promoted and helped us get butts in seats. So thank you, Pam, to helping make that a reality. And yes, it was, as you guys know, Horizons was postponed, and we happen to have a 4-story venue in Chelsea rented, the Horizons after party, for 2 days. So we converted it into a psychedelic unconference, and we had really amazing speakers and panelists, interactivities, including Aaron, who is next to me, and him and Madison spoke on Judaism and psychedelics. Robert Rush, who I believe is here, gave out legal advice. I think to Aaron was a recipient of free legal advice from Robert, and it was a really special 2-day event and after party. And yeah, we're hoping to do it again next October as well. So hope we can have I know Avery almost made it down. It was a bit of a spur of the moment thing, planning a conference in 10 days, but next year we'll be back bigger than ever, and hope to have you all join us down in the city.
Yeah, and I saw the Alex and Allison Gray also were in attendance. They're 2 of my favorite people. They're so amazing.
Who are they?
Yeah, we were lucky to get them and Rick Doblin. It was really awesome. It really came up quickly.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Alex and Allison have the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors down in Wappingers Falls, or COSM, and they host full moon gatherings. And I mean, Alex Gray was inspired by an LSD experience in the 70s when he was on the cusp of taking his own life. And he, at that party where he took the LSD, met Allison, and they then formed artist collective experience, and now have formed a church, which maybe Allison can talk to us a little bit about in a few minutes. And they do not encourage or endorse the consumption of medicines during their ceremonies, but I happen to attend regularly for a period of years, and it was definitely one of the most amazing experiences of my life. And I know that going to their Chapel of Sacred Mirrors down in Wappingers Falls absolutely felt like home. And I was able to perform poetry during their full moon ceremonies, and it was, you know, some of the largest crowds I've performed for, and it was so great to get, you know, immediate feedback from people right there. It was really cool. Yeah, Pammy, did you want to add anything? Anything going on with Psychedelic Sisterhood?
Well, I don't know if you can hear, it's a little bit echoey in the background. I'm actually in the process of moving. So I'm taking a little bit of a break in December from the Psychedelic Sisterhood, and in general, just a resting period. But in January and February, I should be kicking back up again with some events. But I'm very hopeful for what's in the future, and I look forward to coming back to Brooklyn in January.
Nice, nice. So I am going to segue into Allison in a second, and I just want to, if we have time, we'll follow up with some official business things. But in order to respect Allison's time, in case she has to bounce off a little early, I do want to introduce her. And thank you so much, Allison, for coming. I did read your 5 questions on the microdose article that just came out as well, which I hope you're going to speak to. I love the definition of, you know, the religious, what a religious experience or a religious practice actually encompasses, and the vagueness that the law has about it. And so I'm interested to hear how people have navigated that. And just as an introduction, Allison Hoots is an attorney at Hoots Law Practice, and she practices in the legal areas of contract, employment, business, tax, and intellectual property. She has experience advising churches on incorporation, operation, corporate compliance, and best practices in the religious use of plant medicine, and consistent with the right to religious exercise, such as pursuant to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. She's also on the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants, and she's the lead author of Chacruna's Guide to RFRA. Is that the Religious Freedoms Restoration Act?
Correct.
Cool. I took a wild guess at that. And best practices for psychedelic plant medicine churches. Allison is also president and a member of the board of directors of the Sacred Plant Alliance, an association of churches that collaborate to establish best practices, foster professional development, create accountability, and promote a path of legal security for the safe and ethical religious use of psychedelic sacraments within the United States. Allison.
Thank you. It's so long when you read it. Thanks so much. And I'm also part of NYMA in sort of that magic mycelium kind of way. Aaron, who's on the call, found me somehow on the internet, but we're all connected anyway with friends, and asked me to come in and work with NYMA. And so I've been working with NYMA for almost a year, almost now, right? I mean, gosh, it feels like it. So I work in a variety of areas when it touches psychedelics, mostly with respect to practitioners, trip sitters, which I like to call risk reduction support service providers, which isn't as sexy as trip sitter, but trip sitters to more medical, clinical, ketamine assisted psychotherapy practitioners to religious practitioners with communities that in the United States we call churches, despite people's feelings about that term. And generally, you know, what Avery was referring to today, what I was talking about on the microdose is sort of the malleability of the word religion and church, and the way I think people are turning away from mainstream concepts and trying to use them in a way that really do reflect modern practices, and in a lot of ways actually very indigenous traditional practices that have been adapted for modern life. So there is a law, which is Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It's a federal law, which people like to call RFRA. And RFRA is quite a fascinating law with its history, because it was in fact enacted by Congress in response to the US Supreme Court's failure to protect individuals who had been using peyote. So the foundation of RFRA and much of the religious freedom rights in the United States is because of sacramental use of a psychedelic, which is pretty interesting if you think about it. And of course, it's been used in a variety of ways, from refusing to give birth control to employees in the Hobby Lobby case, to Christian foster organizations refusing to allow homosexual individuals, gay individuals, to foster children. But what's interesting is if we look at all of these cases, it's actually expanded freedom in the religious exercise context for psychedelic use. And it's what's exciting is that you can take some of these decisions that may not feel great and apply them to what is an individual's religious beliefs. So when we talk about religion, religion has been defined multiple times. And ultimately, at some point in case law, the Hobby Lobby case, which was the birth control case, the Supreme Court said, you know what, we can't actually define religion. It's wrong for us to say what is religion and what isn't. Instead, we're going to look to whether the religious beliefs are sincerely believed and their conviction in those beliefs. And so that's a really exciting case. But what's most important to the psychedelic movement is the case that occurred. So RFRA was enacted in 1993. I always forget it's 92 or 93. I bet Robert Rush could say. But in 2006, a church that is, I can't say the Brazilian name of the church, but they go by the UDV. And in Brazil, this church has been operating for many, many years, and in fact, does offer ayahuasca in Brazil, and this is legal. And there's a long lineage there. But they came to the United States, and they had a couple of locations, and their ayahuasca was seized in having it shipped, and they were being threatened with criminal prosecution. And what RFRA does is it said, well, I have it written here, so I'm just going to read it to you, which is, it was 93. So RFRA states that government shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, even if the burden results from a rule of general applicability, even except when the law is in furtherance of a compelling government interest and is the least restrictive means of doing so. I can get into like all of the law about it. Like, so this is the strict scrutiny test that courts apply to government action. It's the most strict application of the protection of fundamental rights from government law or action. What happened was in the Supreme Court case where the peyote wasn't protected, they had said, well, the Controlled Substances Act and the law that says that unemployment benefits shouldn't be given to people who break the law, none of that targeted religion. So it was generally applicable. And so therefore, we don't actually have to apply strict scrutiny, the strictest test to the government action here. And instead, we can do intermediate scrutiny. And ultimately, the government was not required to pay unemployment benefits to these individuals who, interestingly, had worked at an addiction center, but had been drug tested, and they found peyote in their system, which has mescaline, which is a controlled substance. And so they were fired and denied unemployment. So this law, RFRA, reinstated strict scrutiny, even if the law is generally applicable, which is basically the Controlled Substances Act, right? Like, it doesn't target a particular religion. It just generally applies to a substance. And so this church, the UDV, in 2006, filed a lawsuit. So RFRA allows a person, actually, it says in the law, a person. So, it doesn't have to be a church. A person can file a claim, meaning they feel that they've been burdened and they're going to file a claim because of the substantial burden, or raise a defense. So, for example, if there were like felony charges against someone, they could say, well, yes, that's true, but, so affirmative defense, I was doing this thing because it was my religious exercise. And so the UDV said, we are substantially burdened. We are in fear of prosecution. The government has taken our sacrament, which is blasphemous. We feel that at any moment they're going to come knock on our door. We don't feel we can hold ceremony. We are in fear, and we have to make a choice here. Either we engage in our religious exercise, or we're in violation of the law and we are being burdened. And actually, the government conceded the substantial burden argument in this case, which is interesting because later it is more relevant, but they conceded there was a substantial burden. So then once you say, okay, there is a substantial burden, this is religious exercise, which is a whole other analysis, is it religion? Is it sincere? The government then says, well, okay, we're burdening, maybe it's religious exercise, but we have interests in burdening this religious exercise. And those interests in a psychedelic church context that have been raised are, one, they have to protect the health and safety of citizens, of the participants in the church. And they think that the Controlled Substances Act does protect the citizens, right? Because Controlled Substances Act has different schedules, 5 schedules, and it is based on basically that these substances have potential for abuse. And then once you get past the abuse aspect, they're then divided up into the 5 categories based on the medical use, like ability to use in a medical context and ability to use in a medical context safely. And so they said, well, we have an interest in applying the Controlled Substances Act because we have to protect citizens from these substances that are dangerous. And the second was, well, the other concern we have is they're probably also using the substance for non-religious uses, which is called diversion. It actually happens that concept is also applied in like a medical context. So, the DEA basically considers diversion issues when it comes to pharmacies, when it comes to research with psychedelics as well. I find it a little funny that diversion is an issue in religious use context, because they're basically like, well, okay, religious use is good, but we don't want you to use it for non-religious purposes. So the UDV made really great arguments. And one of the arguments they made was with respect to safety, was that, look, there's all this safety data. So it's really interesting how the science and like all of these research studies that, especially now, I just saw something from, it was on LinkedIn where it said there were like 80 studies that just published results in October. And so like there's so much coming up now, but just going back to 2006, when it wasn't such a hot topic, they were able to use studies about ayahuasca in particular, whereas the government was using data around DMT and not necessarily ayahuasca specific about safety. And the court ended up saying, well, you both have data. The government saying DMT is dangerous, but the church was able to show that religious use, the ceremonial use of DMT in ayahuasca, actually didn't cause any major harms, and there was safety. They were able to show safety. So the government ended up saying, well, it's equal. And because it's equal, we're going to favor the church. And they were also able to show that they had protocol. Well, they also engaged in screening, right? So that's also a really important part, which we also see as a key part of research protocol, right? It was medical screening for people to participate. And that screening basically was looking to health conditions, looking to whether someone was on a substance that would be contraindicated with ayahuasca, and also their commitment to the religious concepts of the church, and that people were actually turned away who did not believe in the concepts of the ceremony, so the religious beliefs of the church. And so they were able to demonstrate that they had minimized the government's interest in protecting participants, because the way they offered ceremony was safe, and they had a history of having ceremony that people were actually in a really good health. And then the other thing they showed was basically that they brought in their sacrament, they kept it locked up, only certain authorized individuals could access the ayahuasca, and they only used it during ceremonies. And so they prevented diversion. And in showing that, the government conceded there was a substantial burden, they were able to show they were a religious organization, a church. What helped for sure is that they had this lineage of being a church in Brazil. I think also relevant to note is the UDV is a Judeo-Christian church, really. So there was a lot of things that were familiar to the court, right? Like they were able to say like, okay, yeah, they have like services, they have holidays, they have certain clothes they wear to the holidays, and ceremony. And so it was like very familiar to them. And they were able to show that they minimized the government's interests, which was in protecting the health and safety of participants and preventing diversion. So that is how the RFRA analysis is applied in a psychedelic church case. So that was a U.S. Supreme Court case. And one of my favorite quotes from that case was basically the Supreme Court looked at ayahuasca and said, gosh, this sounds like such a terrible experience to sit in ceremony with the vomiting and the hallucinations, and like the whole experience was so intense that clearly this isn't recreational, it must be religious. So I always find that kind of interesting to think about, because they really do think about the psychedelic itself. So that decision was a Supreme Court case, which is pretty impressive that the Supreme Court ultimately decided in favor of a psychedelic church. 3 years, or promptly actually after that, the DEA realized they needed to do something about it and started to develop an exemption application guideline. They ended up releasing that in 2009, which was at the exact same time as another case that also succeeded. This was in the Ninth Circuit. It was the Santo Daime case, also an ayahuasca church, also a Brazilian church with Judeo-Christian concepts. But they also won. They did have to fight about the substantial burden argument, but they were able to show that the use of ayahuasca was central to their religious exercise. So they really could not exercise their religious beliefs otherwise, which is basically like the safest way to argue a religious belief being burdened, because if you say it's just related to your religious beliefs, there may not be a substantial burden. It's actually a circuit by circuit analysis. But they were able to show they were a religion, they were sincere, they, and basically all the same things, right? That they were protecting participants by doing screening, and they were preventing diversion because use of their sacrament was solely for religious purposes. So I think what's interesting was, let's just see, with the DEA, what I was saying about their exemption application process was this guideline that they put out in 2009 was meant to be temporary, but it remains since 2009, has not gone through the rulemaking process, was never really fixed to have like a concrete timeline. And in my opinion, I think that the DEA exemption application process is a burden on religious exercise, because if you do apply for this exemption, you are meant to stop engaging in ceremony until you have a decision. And without a timeline, some churches who have applied have waited up to 5 years and not heard anything back. And the one church that did get a determination on their application was denied for a lot of reasons that I think would not have been viable if it was a religion analysis in a non-psychedelic context. But so there's this inconsistency in how religion is analyzed when it comes to psychedelics. That said, there are definitely other psychedelics that could be a sacrament and used in ceremony and successfully win in court. We just haven't seen it yet. The only psychedelic sacrament that has received protection is ayahuasca. And I do think part of it is because there is a lineage, there is traditional practice with this substance, and because it's such a difficult substance. But I do think that psilocybin has a lot of potential. There is lineage, long-standing traditional practices with psilocybin in a ceremonial context. I mean, we know the Maria Sabina story, which is where basically this guy went down to Mexico and sat with this Mexican woman who served psilocybin mushrooms to people in her small town. It's sort of a terrible story and very much about cultural appropriation. And it's actually pretty horrible what happened to Maria Sabina. But there is some lineage there. And what we are seeing in a significant way is a lot of scientific studies around safety of psilocybin. So just sort of calling back to the Agarwal case, which just to clarify a little bit of what happened there, I'm really good friends with Matt Zorn, who's the attorney for Sunil. I'm really good friends with Sunil. Actually, Matt Zorn and I just filed an amicus brief about psychedelic churches about 3 weeks ago, which is pretty interesting. But in that case, basically anyone can petition the DEA to reschedule a substance under the Controlled Substances Act. Anyone, like a person, which is pretty incredible that we all have that power. Sunil was brave enough to do it, I think, as an organization, right? It's with his AIMS group. And what happened in that case was that when they petitioned for rescheduling, the DEA said, we've explained why they were denied. And the court said, actually, you didn't explain it, right? Like there's an 8-factor test, and they didn't actually like individually parse out why psilocybin should be rescheduled based on the 8-factor test, but had submitted a lot of evidence that did consist of those answers. And so, you know, I think no one's like totally happy about that decision in the Ninth Circuit, but I don't think the DEA is happy about it. I don't think Sunil is particularly happy about it. But what they wanted was they wanted the petition to be pushed to HHS, where something would have progressed. But instead, the court booted it back to the DEA to explain why they hadn't successfully explained the petition. So I think it was sort of like moot in a way. But you know, there's so many studies now about psilocybin and its safety. And ultimately what that may mean is it could be rescheduled because it has medical use and it could be used in a medical context safely, but we don't really have a lot of clarity about religious use with psilocybin yet. There were a couple cases. I actually defended a rabbi who went by the Mushroom Rabbi in Colorado, who I think had a really great case, but when 122 passed in Colorado, the DA ended up dropping the charges. There was a guy in New Hampshire who had a lot of psilocybin containing mushrooms, and he said he was a minister for a church. They ended up dropping the charges there. And I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of charges being dropped because I think there is a fear about setting new case law with a decision. So we're sort of stuck, right? Like we really want to see what that law would be, you know, what the case decision would be in these other contexts. But we're not really getting those decisions. But, you know, what they would look at is whether the person's use of the substance is religious. Like I said, there are criteria. The criteria for religion is different from a criteria of a church, by the way, which is interesting to talk about. But I know I don't have a ton of time. But religion really is, you know, does it look like they deal with those very lofty concepts of ultimate life purposes and you know, what is the divine and morality and basically what we think religion looks like in the United States, which is I think where we trip up a little bit, right? Because religion is so individualized, and what one person believes is completely different than another person, even within the same church, right? And so someone's interpretation of religion, I think, would be respected. Then the question is, yes, it's religious, but is it confirming the government's interest in applying the Controlled Substances Act? And so it would come down to, you know, safety, not just safety of the substance, but the way you serve that sacrament and ceremony. And then also whether, you know, like in a lot of ways, where you're sourcing your sacrament from, which is a really interesting concept, right? In one particular case, somebody was claiming that cannabis was their sacrament. And the government ended up concluding that they weren't sincere because they were sourcing cannabis from the same place they bought cocaine. So they were buying it from the same dealer. So actually that's an interesting, I'm going to take it back a little bit. So basically sincerity, right? So we now know religion is really malleable, but they're going to look to sincerity and conviction. And the court has identified in one particular case what isn't sincere. And what isn't sincere is actually pretty interesting. And it's if someone is mostly engaged in commercial activities, right? So like it clearly isn't religious, but it's actually more basically like a drug dealer. You know, that's what they're implying. Are you a drug dealer? Or actually in the one DEA exemption application analysis with this church called SoulQuest, who is actually suing right now because of the DEA's decision to deny them an exemption application, they said that SoulQuest looked more like a wellness center. So it was not actually a religion, but something else, something commercial. And I've always had a lot of issues with that underlying premise, because if you look to religious, just even like, you know, Judeo-Christian churches, mainstream churches, there's a lot of wellness. There's a lot of whole life involvement. And so to say something, you know, is too focused on somebody's well-being, and therefore isn't religion, feels like a double standard to me. So, you know, we've got all these amazing, interesting cases happening. And even now, some really exciting cases. There's the Church of Eagle and Condor, which is a multi-sacrament church. It uses, I think, peyote and ayahuasca, I'm pretty sure. They are also in the Ninth Circuit. There's a lot going on in like California and Arizona, as we all know. And another court case is the SoulQuest case. They're suing. There's many of these happening right now. So we're really just sitting around waiting to see more cases to have more facts to analyze these practices with. But you know, it's happening really fast. Cases are coming up much more quickly. People are being much more public with their use of psychedelics. There's decrim happening. There's legalization happening in Oregon and Colorado. And all of these factors are going to come into newer cases about religious use. I think a lot of the research that is coming up now around safety would be beneficial to someone arguing that they actually diminish the government's interest in protecting participants because it's not that dangerous. And people can use these substances in ways that are safe. And I think the diversion issue is going to be really, really interesting in states where it's decriminalized. You know, can it be diverted? You know, is it like a fair analysis to say that there's a high risk of diversion because people use these substances recreationally? Or does it actually go the other way around? You know, people have enough access to these substances in a recreational way or therapeutic way even, that it's not like there's a high risk of diversion because basically they have other access points. So it's interesting to see all these things happening simultaneously, right? We've got the clinical, medical, therapeutic side, we've got the recreational side, and we have the religious use. So it's really like there's a lot of exciting things happening all at the same time that are going to influence each other in a pretty significant way. Trying to think, how much more time do I have, Avery? Do you know? Oh, just whenever, just keep going. So yeah. 10 minutes? Okay, cool. Let's see. So one really interesting thing that's been coming up is the issue of an individual's practice versus a church, right? So like, do you have to be a church to have a religious use protection or argument? And I would say no. You know, we did have this guy in New Hampshire who he did claim to be part of ONAC and had psilocybin mushrooms, but he really didn't have to, like, he at no point proved he was part of a church and like this was particularly for a church. He just claimed it was for religious purposes. And they dismissed the charges there, which, by the way, I should also very importantly note that RFRA is a federal law. And there was a case called Byrne v. Flores, which happened a couple years later, that said, we actually can't require that state courts apply strict scrutiny. So do the same analysis. The state should be able to decide how to interpret the right of religious exercise and analysis. And so it is state by state. And some states, which are generally more conservative states, have adopted their own state level RFRA, which people call mini RFRAs, which I find very cute. And then liberal states, they actually have decrim. So, you know, state by state, you're going to get something different, and circuit by circuit, you're going to get something different. You know, so I was saying, you know, like that substantial burden analysis in the majority of states, they only require that you show it's related to your religious activity or religious beliefs. But in a minority of circuits, they require that you show a centrality analysis, that it's central to your religious exercise, integral, and that you could not engage in your religion, or, you know, to fully embody your religious beliefs without this practice. And yet we've seen some circuits switch. So when it comes to a psychedelic, a church that, or excuse me, a circuit that did use the majority view of it just has to be related, actually then said, well, no, it has to be a central part. This was in the Sixth Circuit. So they swapped it, which just goes to show the effect of the drug war and stigma around controlled substances. So yes, individuals, you know, we haven't seen anyone set precedent with RFRA and a psychedelic yet. Let's see, what else would I talk about? Oh, and there was another really interesting case that came out in 2022 in the Ninth Circuit, because again, there's so much in the Ninth Circuit, and it wasn't a religious land use and institutionalized persons case, but it uses the same concepts of religious exercise. But they said, basically, you cannot prefer the religious beliefs of the mainstream and long-standing beliefs. Instead, someone who is even like recently a convert and believes in a particular thing has to have those beliefs protected, which I thought was a fascinating decision, and actually referred back to a US Supreme Court case. So like I said, you know, things are just changing every day. Let's see, one thing, I wanted to just go back and I itemize what the way you could show that someone wasn't sincere in their religious exercise. One is ad hoc beliefs, which is like basically you're just trying to get around it, circumvention. The second was the quantity of the controlled substance. So, you know, if you have so much, it's clearly not just for your congregation. You know, there's no way your congregation could have enough ceremonies in the next 5 years to use up all of the whatever substance you have. Clearly, it's something else going on. Evidence of commerce, which I mentioned earlier. And this one I actually really like, you know, which maybe people won't like me for it, but that there's a lack of ceremony or ritual. So basically, if, you know, I'm not trying to call anyone out, but like I know one example is there is a church in California that is just selling psilocybin mushrooms at their store, and they don't actually hold ceremonies. And so I think, you know, just analyzing that example, right, is they have a lack of ceremony. There's evidence of commerce. Are they minimizing government interests in protecting participants? We don't know. Are they doing the screening? Are they with the individuals during the ceremony to make sure that they're safe? And are they preventing diversion? Well, if the people are just buying the substance and running off with it, how are you preventing diversion? So it's interesting to see that applied to like modern day instances of what people are claiming is a church. Let me see what else I'd like to talk about. Does anyone have any questions? I've been rambling for quite a bit. Feel free to raise your hand.
I know you answered two of my questions, which was can an individual through their, I guess the question becomes, is it spiritual or religious? But like if their own spiritual practice involves, you know, a psychedelic or entheogenic sacrament, that is allowed if one is sincere, is what I'm getting, right?
Well, allowed is an interesting question, but it would present as a great argument, yes.
Yeah.
Um,
And then my other question was, has anyone sued the DEA? And you answered that. And then my third one that is still up unanswered is, how does one petition the DEA to reschedule a substance? And why aren't we all just doing that constantly?
right. Well, I mean, you can see like, so suing the DEA is interesting. So, right. So the Soul Quest is suing based on the decision it made. The amicus brief that we just filed is in connection with a church that actually filed for 501c3 status as a nonprofit church and was denied because they stated in their application that they used ayahuasca. And the court decided, after, you know, the IRS denied them twice, the court said, well, you should have gotten the DEA exemption through their application process. You should have done that. We don't think it was the IRS's responsibility to decide if your use of ayahuasca was religious or not. And you can't be a 501c3 and engage in illegal activity, because basically a nonprofit entity is subsidized by the government, right? You don't pay taxes, so in a way subsidized. And so we were saying that these arguments were wrong. Basically, those guidelines are not a law. The DEA did not engage in the rulemaking process, so the court cannot require exhaustion of the administrative process there, because it's not really an administrative process yet. And also that the IRS did in fact injure the church by making the decision that it made, and that it is fully capable, the IRS of all agencies, the one that determines whether something is a church. The IRS, in fact, may be the most capable agency in engaging in a RFRA analysis, which is to say, okay, is a church using a psychedelic substance actually engaged in religious exercise? And, you know, is there any injury to the IRS in granting nonprofit status to a church that uses a controlled substance? And so anyway, it's a really interesting, so that case is fascinating. So we just filed that. So I'm excited to see what decision comes from that. But yeah, so can somebody petition for the rescheduling of a substance? Yes, but it's probably very expensive, and takes a lot of time. It's been years and years for Ames and what they've been doing there. The DEA has been giving them a complete runaround, right? So first they told them, well, we're not going to reschedule. And then they said, okay, well, we're going to appeal that decision. The DEA was like, well, we didn't actually make a final decision on whether we're denying your petition, so you can't appeal it. And so they went back and they were like, well, can you please make the final decision? So they're going to mess with you. And that's what's happening with these other churches, right? They've said, you know, we're suing the DEA. Here's how you've injured us, the substantial burden. Here we are engaged in religious exercise. And the DEA will pull things like, you know what? You didn't sue us in the right court, right? So, you know, they're being very evasive, which is what their attorneys' jobs are. Because I do wonder how that analysis would go down, particularly with the expansion of religious rites in the United States, that, you know, was outside of psychedelic use, but does apply. And all of the data we have now about safety, about basically like what's happening in the States with decrim and legalization, and how is that increasing diversion risks or decreasing diversion risks? So it'll be super interesting to see actual analysis in the courts rather than evasion of this analysis. Trying to think if there's anything else really fun that I'd like to talk about. If anyone else has a question, feel free to
I
jump
think we
in.
do have some more questions in the room, and then we'll see if anyone online has some questions. Corinne?
Hi, Allison. It sounds like you and a number of attorneys across the country are advising churches or groups that are trying to establish themselves as churches about how to go about it. And it also sounds to me like not when people are getting caught. I guess I'm curious about how people are getting caught. Are they getting caught in kind of a slipshod way where somebody slips up, or there's a particular prosecutor who gets wind of something? Or
Right.
is it a deliberate, you know, are they being thoughtful about who they prosecute? Or are people just being quiet about their activities? Like, what's the reality on the ground for people who are trying to do this?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting variety, from way groups are operating to how they're getting caught. There are some churches that have been doing this for like 20, 30, 40 years and have been working with the same congregation or community of people, really have perfected their practices, their protocol, and are mostly staying quiet because it's worked for them. In fact, in the Santo Daime case, they continued to offer ceremony during the case, and the court said, actually, your quiet continuation of religious exercise shows your sincerity, which is pretty interesting. But then there's some groups that have gotten very loud. You know, they're publicly advertising, and in fact, one of the identification of a problem that government has said was advertising, which wouldn't apply to any normal church, right? Like, we know lots of normal churches have giant billboards. In fact, I actually think the one church in Detroit had a big billboard, but they were just recently recently raided, and like all of their psilocybin mushrooms were taken. So that was an interesting case. Soul Tribes was the name. But generally when a client comes to me and they ask, which should we do? It's really about their beliefs, right? We don't have anyone who has successfully applied for an exemption through the DEA guidelines. The only thing we've seen successful is operating quietly or waiting for there to be a substantial burden and then filing a claim. So generally, I just tell clients that they should just prepare as best they can to be the next test case. And so to prepare your articulation of religious beliefs, to have emergency protocol for when someone has an adverse event or emergency during a ceremony, to train your helpers, to have ways that you have oversight over your ministers to make sure there aren't abuses of power, to have diversion protocol, anti-diversion protocol. So, you know, who is holding the sacrament? Where is it being stored? Are you keeping records of it being used solely in ceremony? Do you have communications with your congregants about screening and other safety mechanisms within the church? And also support afterward, which is integration, which, you know, we see also has been now utilized in a clinical context. So, you know, I think it's all about preference. However, I have a strong belief that things are going to shift, and that there will be a viable way to apply for and receive an exemption sometime soon. Maybe I like to joke, I'm like willfully naive and optimistic about it. But I do think there's a lot of pressure coming from communities that are more, there is conviction, there is sincerity. They truly believe that this is sacrament. It's how they access divinity, how they connect with their spiritual beliefs. And it's going to be really hard to argue with that in court. So yeah, I basically say just prepare. But yeah, every case is going to affect the larger community of churches. And so, the more we can all share best practices and, learn from one another, the better off we're all going to be in this effort, in this movement. And also, we mostly see the bad media, right? Like, oh gosh, like this one church is doing something awful, but we don't hear about the hundreds of churches doing things really, really well.
See, Aaron, you have a question?
Or Colin.
Or Colin?
Hi, Colin.
Hey. Hey, Allison. Good to see you. I'm calling in as Aaron. Well, Aaron and I are here having some dinner. Thank you for this great talk. It was super informative. I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but if someone were to go about starting a psychedelic church, would the kind of ABC 1, 2, 3, 101 guide be: one, you have to have a religious doctrine that members can assent to? Like, what would be the first 3 things, I guess, like a group would need to do? It sounds like one, have like a a doctrine people can assent to, hopefully, honestly, and then any others. And is that correct, that that'd be the main thing? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the Soul Quest case, well, not case, right? Application to the DEA, the denial pointed to the fact that the church had referred many times to an ayahuasca manifesto, yet no one who attended ceremony had ever heard of that. So, having consistency, making sure that everyone who attends knows exactly what your religious beliefs are. Yeah, that's huge. That's often one of the first exercises I go through with a client is I have like a questionnaire. I'm like, put into writing exactly what your beliefs are. So absolutely. It helps to incorporate, but I'm a lawyer who really loves, the protection of an entity. But I also really see a lot of value in having a nonprofit corporation that's required to have a board where people are creating accountability, financial accountability, ethical accountability. So I really like to see that as well. And I also think it's really helpful to use the concepts that these government agencies will understand, right? They understand the word church. They understand a minister. They understand congregation. So I use that language. I use the jargon of the law, when really someone would probably be more comfortable saying a spiritual community, a religious leader, or just leader, and just basically like things that are not mainstream jargon. So being able to articulate, having some kind of like recognizable form, and then I'd say really working on these protocol, about medical screening and about diversion. So just getting ahead and addressing those government interests and minimizing them as best as you can. Make sure you're doing things as safely as possible. Make sure that you're keeping your sacrament in a secure location, and consider the spiritual meaning of your sourcing. What I really loved about the Gorelick case was he very strongly believed that he had to cultivate his psilocybin containing mushrooms because the way he did it was kosher. And there was a spiritual context to it. And I thought that was really cool. So like in the Soul Quest case, Soul Quest was acquiring the components of ayahuasca from a soap company in Amsterdam. That didn't end up looking particularly spiritual, according to the DEA, which is also like a conundrum, right? If you can't go get your sacrament from your spiritual source, and then you're penalized for accessing it another way. That's kind of hypocritical, but it is the way the DEA analyzed that particular fact in that application. But, you know, that's also the DEA. That wasn't a court. Anyone else?
Hey, Allison, I'm Dennis. I came late, so I don't know if you mentioned the Chacruna guide for churches. If not, I can upload it to the chat. And
Yes.
it's a guide that I use to found a church in Buffalo.
Amazing. I wrote that.
Yeah, you were there on those meetings. Yeah.
Yeah. I joke that was my third baby because that
Oh,
was right after I had my son. I wrote that for about 9 months. Took me about 9 months. But that's I would love to rewrite that guide, but it's a very good like foundational explanation of the law and protocol that a group could adopt to prepare them for a RFRA claim or defense. Well, thank you
well,
for mentioning that. I'm glad you liked it.
well, all gratitude to you because that was um, just indispensable, that guide. Yeah. Thank
Oh.
you.
And
Do you
Dennis,
want me
as
to upload
someone,
it?
Yeah, you can link to it. I'm actually going to be giving my 3-hour workshop on this topic because I actually can talk about this I gave you the very succinct version on December 6th through the Chacruna Institute. So if this is interesting to anyone, come join for the 3-hour version. I actually at the MAPS conference in Denver did a 4-hour workshop, and I thought I was gonna run out of things, and I actually ran out of time. So I just want to say I can really
Deep.
talk about this. Yes. So
Dennis, can you take a second to tell us a little bit about the lens and what you guys did and how you incorporated the Chacruna document, if you would?
Yeah, we registered as a church and got our sort of the charter for our church filed at the county. And then we got, a bank account. And so we had a checkbook. And so when we created retreats and took money in for the retreats, we made sure to, everything go through that account. And our charter had very much like what Allison was talking about, talked about our protocols for selecting board members and oversight. And it had lyrics to hymns we would sing every week because we had integration groups that had music. And so we made sure that we, on a very regular basis for over 3 years, we were, doing everything churches do and would be very familiar to a casual observer. And if you were to ask each person kind of like where they were at with it, they could tell you what this all meant to them in language that was familiar. And as Allison said too, like maybe our language internally was slightly different than it was externally, because we knew that the church was the sort of interface to the larger community.
that really warms my heart that,
Mhm.
that the guide is being used. So that's great. Yeah, because I do think that sometimes people resist these terms because they don't feel familiar or, based on their own previous experiences of what a church is. But I think that we have an opportunity now to bring religion and spiritual practice and protections of those things into a modern era. And I think that there's a lot of beauty in the gathering for a spiritual experience, for the ceremony. And there is, the Santo Daime in their case, they actually showed that their particular community was a healthier population than the broader population. And that was a big part of the analysis of the court, that the government didn't have an interest in protecting the safety of participants because they were doing such a good job taking care of their community. There really is something to that spiritual care and development and health of someone when they meet together in a group and they share in a spiritual experience and they support one another. So yeah, there's something very important about communal use. And, you know, if you're comfortable and feel sincere that you could call that a religious use, then I think you have every right to do so and to derive the rights and protection afforded others who have gone ahead and called their activities religious in the past.
One of the authors that really helped rehabilitate, I think, for the community of spiritual but not religious people that were drawn to the lens was Peter Kingsley. And if you read his stuff, it's kind of psychedelic, but it's not explicitly psychedelic. But he, anyway, he made me very unself-conscious about saying things like religious.
Allison, do you have time for a couple more questions? We have some people in the room that have something for you.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Hi, Allison. I had a question about what your opinion is on states like Oregon that have legalized medical use of psilocybin for mental health, for depression, for example, and whether you think that will open up the doors and make it easier for religious freedom for such use.
I think it's really important to recognize that Oregon actually isn't a medical model. It is a supported use model. So in Oregon, you're allowed to sit with a facilitator in a service center and take psilocybin in a supported session. And it is actually very explicitly not therapeutic and not medical. I think what will be interesting is when psilocybin, the synthetic substance, is scheduled as a different scheduled substance, right? So Schedule 1 is currently where psilocybin, DMT, most psychedelic substances exist. Hi, guys. And there's something called bifurcated scheduling, which is when a synthetic medical substance, a substance that's gone through FDA approval, is rescheduled as Schedule 2 or 3, meaning it can be prescribed, right? Because Schedule 1, you can't prescribe it. Schedule 2 can be prescribed because it says it can be used safely supervised in a medical way. But what can happen, and it's going to happen with MDMA, and it's probably going to happen with psilocybin, is the version that has gone through FDA approval run by some pharmaceutical company, that will be rescheduled, but the remaining substance, like the natural substance, may remain in Schedule 1. Very strange. But do I think, yes, I mean, I think that being able to show safety of these substances will absolutely affect religious use analysis. What I think it may be even more complicated, though, if it is a medical, like a prescribable substance. So, you know, I do wonder about, you know, like, let's say, I'm trying to think of an example, but like a substance that could be prescribed if someone suddenly was like, well, actually, I'm going to get this illegally and use it as a sacrament. I don't know how that analysis would go. We haven't really seen that yet. I do know churches that use MDMA as a sacrament, and I'm really curious to see, you know, what's going to happen when it's rescheduled, which will probably be in the next year or so.
So it'd be like Adderall as a sacrament or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to think of something comparable, but Yeah, and we kind of don't know. And that's sort of one of the frustrating things in my area is a lot of the time people are like, what's the best way to do this to, you know, protect myself in a religious use claim or defense, or in terms of like liability, like will my agreement hold up in court? And I have to be like, I don't know. We don't really we don't have like cases with trip sitters who had an agreement and somebody got hurt and then somebody sued the trip sitter for a breach of a duty of care or something, right? We don't have that yet because we're seeing this like incredible expansion of use of psychedelics just in the last 4 years, and people creating businesses now, right? So we're gonna, I think, in the next 5 years, see significant development in the legal sphere with respect to religious use, enforceability of contracts, liability, risk reduction or harm reduction activities, how they'll be treated in the law. There was a really interesting case, the lightning in a bottle case, which was a festival that actually Zendo project was there and MAPS was there, and they over assured safety because of these harm reduction offerings, and they were ultimately held liable and owed millions of dollars to the family of a woman who died, who had taken her own concoction of substances at the festival, and they were just there to provide harm reduction. So I mean, yeah, this was just in the last couple of years. So that's not a great case. And we also saw the use of safe injection sites was deemed illegal because of the crack house statute. So like something that was a risk reduction effort, where someone could inject an opiate using clean needles in Philadelphia, they said that's actually illegal because you are creating a location that is managed for the purpose of the use of an illegal substance. And they equated it to a crack house. So it's frustrating because there would be so much more safety in the use of these substances if they were rescheduled, if harm reduction services were allowed to be offered, if churches were able to be granted exemptions and call for emergency services without hesitation, because we don't even know how Good Samaritan law would protect those churches in those cases yet. So yeah, I think ultimately what the government often argues, which is that there's harm and risk, is not just compounded, but maybe actually created by the Controlled Substances Act and their analogs in the states.
There was one more question in the room? There? Yeah. Okay. Anyone online have any other questions?
I've got a question.
Yeah, I do.
Cool.
Can I, as a patient that has something called suicide headache, cluster headache, can I sue the government for blocking access to something that stops the pain? Stops every cluster headache attack. I mean, I'm a fireman, and if I see somebody on the ground on the street rolling in that much pain, it's a medical emergency. I have 8 medical emergencies a day. If it comes down to it, can I sue the government for access to this?
I mean, in a religious use context, like, basically the last however long I've been talking worth of argument you'd have to establish, right? But you potentially could also be one of the people who petition for rescheduling. So I don't think you could sue them unless there's a religious use argument. But that's also why we have things like the Breakthrough Therapies Act, right? So like those things are basically like trying to manage these situations where someone who's in like significant peril should have access to a breakthrough therapy. So MDMA was granted breakthrough therapy status, and psilocybin was granted breakthrough therapy status. It hasn't really given people that much access yet, but I think it's really interesting that they were designated that in the last few years though. But yeah, it's horrible, Joe. And that's one of the, we're all doing this work, right? Because we know that there's
Thank
an
you.
important value, medical, spiritual, and recreational. I don't really have a problem with that either if it's done.
Cognitive liberty, right? Cognitive liberty.
Yep.
Yeah.
Life,
But I'll
liberty,
say
and the
one
pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, it's anyway, I could get into like the whole way that drugs are scheduled and the problems I have with the term abuse, and basically the conditions that have led to us deciding that any substance that alters our consciousness is abuse. But
Thank you.
Robert, you had a question too?
Yeah, I've got a question. Being that we're on the just past the 1-year anniversary of the Natural Medicine Health Act, what do you think would have happened if that wouldn't have passed, say, and Rabbi Ben would have gotten to the Supreme Court, being the fact that it is kind of in a cultural context, maybe more approachable for the court, being it's in a Judeo-Christian context? Would that have helped? And also, do you think kind of Ben's kind of unique personality, his mohawk and his EDM brand, things like that might have possibly worked the opposite way from that?
So first, yes, I've had a lot of conversations with Jack Silver. He was one of the attorneys for the Santo Daime case, really lovely human being, but we've spoken a lot about like what the next cases we think would succeed would be. And I definitely think something with ayahuasca in a different Judeo-Christian context might have been a really good next one with psilocybin. But yeah, when you get to some of these like vegetalismo practices, like, does anyone know what that is? Unless, you've had experience with ayahuasca? No, but it's like, it could be the next step if it's ayahuasca and a slightly different religious belief set and practice. I do think psilocybin, a Judeo-Christian looking religion, would be a very strategic next one. So it is really incremental steps. I think we have seen that in lots of ways where the government isn't going to like leap ahead and say, oh yeah, okay, so psilocybin, MDMA, 2CI, or I don't even know the different ones. Yeah, like anything next, totally, it's a sacrament and it's religious use. I think there's going to be a lot of scrutiny around safety, a lot of scrutiny around sincerity, and is it a religion? And then, but I did think Gorelick had a fantastic case because of it being sort of that next logical step, being a Judeo-Christian belief set and psilocybin. I think those are two that are safer, in analysis. I personally believe a lot of these substances are pretty safe. And then also, yes, I do think someone with a mohawk wouldn't be, just the way it is, right? Like, would someone with a mohawk be given as much basically like cred, right, as someone buttoned up? I don't know. At the same time, someone like Joe Tafur with the Church of Eagle and Condor, who is actually a doctor and comes from a lineage of using ayahuasca, I think he's going to present really well in court. But also ayahuasca, we've already seen it protected, right? So here, his religion is a little bit different, but it's a substance we've seen protected. So these small incremental steps are probably going to be what we see in court be successful. But I also tell, my clients, potential clients, you have to go with what you believe, and you just have to, I'm going to tell you the way courts have analyzed it in the past, the way the DEA has analyzed it in the past. And if you want to accept the risk of it being that far outside of, what's already been deemed acceptable or like legal, that's your choice. But if it's what you sincerely believe, then that's what you have to make, that forced choice, right? Which is one of the ways the government analyzes it, or analyzes it, I keep saying that, analyzes it, is is someone forced to choose between their sincere religious exercise and abiding by the law? And in that case, there is a substantial burden, and you have the right to sue. That's the minority view. If everyone's been paying attention, that's the minority view. It's more conservative, but they have applied it in other circuits. So but I would say, yeah.
I was just gonna say, it just feels like we shouldn't let the evening go by without acknowledging that there's a long history of racism and now ethnocentricity with the DEA, and this idea of conform or suffer. It just kept coming up for me as you were talking. It's like it's got to look a certain way, and some cultures are never going to look the way the Supreme Court wants them to look.
Right. And there are risks in that, right? But what I like to say is, you can use the language of oppression, right? Which is, you can use the word church, you can use these terms to translate what your beliefs are so that they're better received in the case of scrutiny. But if this is something you truly believe, then you best prepare to defend those beliefs and try and gain protection. And I love working in this area because I like to consider the ways in which, just like the fundamental right of belief has been suffocated in a lot of ways. And so, that's why I'm doing this. Basically try and advance these more outlier beliefs and practices. I'd also like to help with some of those procedures that actually could increase safety around those practices, right? So sometimes just even having a lawyer help you write out how someone who's helping in a ceremony would deal with an emergency situation, right, can create additional safety, and that will ultimately present better in court.
Well, Allison, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. This was fascinating. I mean, I absolutely appreciate you being here and all that you've done for NYMA over the past year. And yeah, this was phenomenal. I just have two other things I wanted to say. As we progress towards a time when people will be gathering with their friends and family more, some of the things that have come up are like, how do I talk to my family about psychedelic use? And I want to task everyone here with trying a dialogue with someone that they have not talked about this with, and reporting back in January how it went. Because so many people have said, like, I just don't know how to talk to my mom, or something like that. And I think the more that we engage in this dialogue, and the more ammunition we can have for how to be successful in approaching and in navigating the ways that people can derail the conversation, it's going to help everyone. So
I have a suggestion. Put up an Instagram post and ask people to list some conversation starters.
Oh, nice. Yeah,
we can crowdsource
the
deck
all
that
right.
we were talking
All right,
about.
I'll do that. So everybody tune into the New Yorkers for New York Psilocybin Action Committee. I'll put that up. The other two things I wanted to point out is everybody put February 27th on their calendars. We did get confirmation of that, right, Corinne?
No, we didn't yet.
Oh, we didn't.
So it's still tentative.
Okay, we'll still put February 27th
Unless
on your
there's someone
calendar.
from Assemblymember Rosenthal.
No, I don't see anyone from Assemblymember Rosenthal, and the person from Assemblymember Burke's team that was on, unfortunately seems like he jumped, and I would have loved to talk to him for a second. But February 27th so far, hopefully, is when we're going to spend the day at the Capitol. Like this past legislative session, we spent a whole week there. Unfortunately, they're only granting single days. So we will be there all day and trying to grab as many lawmakers as we can in order to cajole, convince, and continue the dialogue around psychedelic access or entheogenic access. And then the last thing is December 12th, which is our next meeting. Bill Brennan, I did already mention it, is going to be talking about his book. So hopefully you come back for that. And did anyone else have any final comments, questions, concerns?
I do.
Pammy.
Would you recommend locking your parents in the room and putting fantastic fungi on for a loop?
Oh.
Would you recommend? That's what I'm resulting to at this point.
Well, and you can just start that off with like, hey, you know, my friend Avery has a mushroom farm and I want to show you this video about like mushrooms. It's really cool. You don't have to, and then it can segue wherever it goes after. Genius. I like it.
I like it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for joining us. If you're in the room, can we, if you don't want a picture taken, then you can just like hide or go around the corner, but I would love to take a picture. I wonder if I could get the computer in the room somehow too.
Good, just put it right here like a person.
You put it right here like a person, and I'll put oh, that's what I'm gonna do. All right, look at that. Well, it's everybody's there. Okay, cool. All right, let's see now if can I use your phone?
Yes.
Cool. I get everybody. Let's see. Get the computer.
No, that's good.
Good job using
Awesome.
walls balance.
Yeah. Beautiful. All right. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
Folks should grab a mushroom.